Okay, so we are fans of the JRPG genre, as I think anybody listening knows. We all like our epics and our fantasies and all that stuff. Um, we thought we'd have a discussion this week or this month for the podcast talking about how developers can go about and publishers can go about sequels for JRPGs, because there's a couple of different ways you can do it. And I've had this kind of question rolling around in my head about which is the right way to go about it for quite some time. So, for example, the Final Fantasy series is largely independent of one another. If you play Final Fantasy IV, um, you don't need to have played Final Fantasies 1 through 3 to kind of follow along with the plot. If you play Final Fantasy 10, that's a self-contained plot that doesn't rely on you knowing what happened in Final Fantasy 8. But on the other hand, there is the Legends of Heroes series, which is quite famous for um, demanding, all but demanding, that you've played every game that's come for it before you can play the next one. And the fans will tell you that too. That's if you dare to like a Trails of game before you've played all the other ones and can talk about how bad this new one is compared to the rest because they really hate new games, then they will chew you out for it. But there is an element of truth in there that certainly those games do rely on building on what's happened beforehand, and whether you can follow along with the plot or not. And you can with most of them. For example, if you were to play the Trails of Cold Steel series, you can follow along with the plot right from the first one. But a lot of what happens in those games references what happened in the previous Trails of series. So your experience of the Legends of Trails of Cold Steel, your experience of that one is really enhanced by having played the previous titles. So
You've been
yeah,
playing Trails from Zero, right?
no, my first Trails game was Cold Steel.
Oh, no, I mean recently though.
Oh yes, I went back to them. I've also played the
Because
PSP one via via the High Seas
methods, yeah.
emulation console. But yeah, so of the Trail series, I've only played the Cold Steel series plus those two. So Zero, which was recently re-released, and then Sky. What was the one
I think
released on
Trails in the
PC?
Sky is its
Trails in the
own
Sky.
big long series.
Yeah, the first one. Whatever one was released on the PSP in English. That was
Hmm.
that's the extent of my Trails experience. And when I do say to people, I love Trails of Cold Steel so much, the fans absolutely hate me for it because I'm not meant to like those games. I'm only meant to like I'm only meant to like the
That's
early
so
ones or
funny.
something or other. The games got bad or something when they put Elisa in, and who knows. Anyway,
You know
um,
what other series has that same dynamic is when you go, "Oh, I love Atlas JRPGs. My favorite game is Persona 5." And everyone's like, "How
I
dare
know.
you not play the 5 Shin Megami Tensei games?"
Yeah, I do that too. When people say I like Persona 5, I'm like, why didn't you play Persona 4, you stupid person?
Oh no, no, Persona 5 is
And
sort of
then
more
you
like the
and then you say
mainstream
I like
games.
Persona 4, and they're like, why didn't you play Persona 3, you stupid person? Yeah, RPG fans are fun. Lots of
Yeah.
fun. But anyway, what are your thoughts about the topic? I mean, would you prefer to play a game that has that's kind of self-contained each time you go into it, or would you prefer to play something that's part of a grander project?
I think now that I don't have as much time in my hands, I prefer self-contained games just because the more stuff I need to remember to understand a game story, the more likely I am to just put it down and not play any more of it. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
I think when I was younger, I did appreciate having a longer game just to hold my attention for a bit more. Like I love the Kingdom Hearts series, but that is a series notorious
Oh,
for if
there's
you don't
another really
play
good
number
example.
one, you will not understand number two, right?
Well,
And
it, Kingdom Hearts is even more famous now because you've got to have played a mobile game that no longer exists to fully
yeah,
understand the
yeah.
plot. It's great.
Yeah, I don't understand how that game gets written. How do they just do they have a almanac of all the terms to make sure they keep it consistent? I just don't understand.
Yeah, but you are right. Kingdom Hearts is another really good example of games that you can probably follow along with the plot, jumping in at any point, but fully understanding what it's saying and what it's doing and the full context of it really relies on you having played other games as well. Um, but you are right. Like time considerations is a big part of it. for example, the Legends of Heroes series, you're looking at what, 1,000 hours now to have
Yeah,
played through
yeah.
all of them. And if you're starting off at ground floor, then that's like trying to watch all of One Piece from episode 1 and actually catch up, and you're just not going to be able to do that. Nobody, even like students, even teenagers that come home from school and then spend the rest of their day doing games or anime or whatever, nobody can catch up at a certain point. And I think some games are at that point now.
I've been told that
Well, it's
One
not
Piece is
just
basically a
time. Like
lifestyle.
half the games you've mentioned it already are like, oh well, this one I had to pirate. This one's like some old game on the PlayStation 2. This is from here. Like games with these lengthy, long stories, where at the stage where it's like, well, you have to fully immerse yourself in the series. You have to go back to the recently released original sequel, but don't worry about that because that has half the bits plot points taken out and changed, so you're not getting the full experience. So you have to go pirate the original version and play that on your emulator, or hunt down like some ancient console, which is really hard to find. And then you have to go
Yeah.
back and play the next two re-releases, and then play the Nintendo 64 version, and then go over here and play this, and this, and then it's really hard to find these games or get them legitimately.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
you
mean-
100% right there, Trent. Like, this is an issue with the way that games archiving and availability is handled, that once a series hits a certain length, it does become completely inaccessible because publishers haven't re-released them, or you're relying on publishers to re-release them. Like, a good example again to talk about Trails of the Legend of
Trails
Heroes series.
Yeah, it's so hard to get the first chapter on things.
Or even
And
even not just that, like Trails of Cold Steel 1 and 2 are getting to the point that they're actually hard to find. You could play them on PC, yes, but if you're a console player, they're not on Switch. They haven't been re-released on the kind of the PS5 and Xbox. So that's an issue. Like, you can jump in halfway through if you're a Switch player, but you can't play the original two. And this is entirely because of the publishing rights are just up in the air and they can't organize themselves. So that's definitely a problem. And that's
also pretty annoying too, because the way the game evolves over time, like the first games probably don't have the same kinds of quality of life improvements that the newer ones do. So if you go onto the old ones, you feel like you're trying to play catch up. You're playing a retro game at this point.
Well, that is also another thing. I mean, if you enjoy the game, but you've come in at, again, Legends of Heroes. I keep talking about Legends of Heroes because it's just such a good example of the problems with doing this.
It's definitely one of the worst cases of this problem.
Yeah. But if you got in with the Trails of Cold Steel, as the Trails of Cold Steel series as I did, you would want to be a big fan of retro RPGs to go back to the earlier ones and experience them. I was able to because I still play Final Fantasy 1 on the NES through every year. So I'm good with the grind. I'm good with the archaic kind of systems of old RPGs. Not a lot of other people are. And more modern players would find it difficult to go from Trails of Cold Steel backwards to play the earlier games. So that is another issue. You can't go through and just redevelop these things to improve them, the gameplay to the point that it's kind of modern. So I would imagine that some people were like that with Zero, which is considered one of the all-time greats of the series, and I enjoyed it a great deal. But if
it's like a 2013 game, right?
Yeah, exactly. If you were a fan of Cold Steel, going back to that still requires you to be, have a bit of nostalgia for retro RPGs. So yeah, it's difficult. I mean, I understand the appeal of doing this. I really do. That you've got this kind of concept. You've got this concept where it's not about a game; it's about a world, and all the different games are telling stories within that world. It's kind of like the Tolkien approach, right? Where Lord of the Rings is just this massive thing that everybody knows and loves. But if you get really into it, then you've got the Silmarillion, you've got the Hobbit, you've got all the lore, you've got the history.
You've got Rings of Power on Amazon Prime.
Let's not talk about Rings of Power before I get really, really upset. But you've got everything but Rings of Power. But you've got just so much depth and so many stories, and the world really feels like it's a history as a result. And you do get that with the Legend of Heroes series as well, where it is more than a game. You feel like you're participating in this like real history of this amazingly complex and detailed world. The appeal of doing so is there, but it is a challenge from a commercial perspective and from an accessibility perspective and everything else. Like everything about the way the games industry is kind of designed conspires to make that approach to game development very difficult for both the players and the developers and publishers.
Is there a long series that goes back to like the SNES days or the NES days?
Would you consider Ys? I mean, Ys has the same dude.
I was gonna say Ys, but Ys is good in that they're basically standalone games. The only difference is that they're in the same world, whereas Final Fantasy are always in different worlds. But you can enjoy Ys from any game starting out, and you don't have to.
I must admit, I'm not like the most in with the Ys series. I play most of them, and they're fine. But do they reference previous games? Like
they do, but you know how Final Fantasy is like Sid, right? Has like the legacy character that reincarnates every incarnation. Ys is just like that, but more. So there's going to be references to previous games, but you don't need to. Like, they're still meaningful if you haven't played the older game. Is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, sure, understood.
Which to me is a better approach anyway, because any game can be your entry to the franchise. And if you happen to love the franchise, then you can go back and play the retro games and see how it all began. But you're not required to start from the very beginning to even enjoy the more modern titles.
Yeah, I must admit, I think the Final Fantasy approach is better from both the developer and the publisher and the consumer, that you can start Final Fantasy at any point and not need to have played the previous ones to get it. Although that's been said, I would suggest that some of the later Final Fantasies is relying a little bit on the history of the series a bit. Like in particular, Final Fantasy 15, the way the music worked, it would, you'd be getting
that's true.
Soundtracks from previous Final Fantasy games, and there are so many nods to previous games in those series now that it becomes like this kind of in commentary in a lot of these games. But for the most part, yes, Final Fantasy works independently of one another, and that means that's good for us because it means that we can jump in at any point. We can recommend people particular Final Fantasy games, and then that can be like their intro to the series. If they like it, like you said, they can go and explore more of them. It's also good for the developer and publisher because it means they can try things, and if they don't work in one game, you can dump them for the next game. Like I remember Final Fantasy VIII. These days, Final Fantasy VIII is actually pretty respected, but back then it was a nightmare of a game for a lot of fans. People did not like Final Fantasy VIII, and it
was really badly explained. The tutorial in that game does not adequately justify how convoluted the systems are.
Well, people hated the draw system because it meant that you'd be spending 3/4 of an hour fighting a bug just to draw enough cures out to max your thing out. So people did not like that combat system. People did not like the characters. Like, people did not like Squall at all. Like, they hated him. So their response was to come back with Final Fantasy IX, which was like a swerve way back to the very traditional Final Fantasy, which people
Nine's pretty
enjoyed
respected all the way through.
Yeah. And the reason they could do that was because they were independent stories, right? So you didn't have to have Final Fantasy IX talk about what happened in Final Fantasy VIII. You didn't have to reference back to the game people didn't like in the game that people do. So there is that, like, from a development and publisher and business standpoint, it makes more sense to make these games independent of one another.
But Final Fantasy is interesting in that it's actually both of these. So I feel like if a Final Fantasy game really sticks, then it'll start, I don't know why I'm going to say pollinating or like sporifying or whatever, and making its own big series. So Final Fantasy VII, for example, you're not going to play Crisis Core first, right? You're not going to play like Dirge of Cerberus, but there is a larger universe to explore if that's what you're into. And I think if the game doesn't take off, then it doesn't get that same universe. Like, there's no extended universe of Final Fantasy VIII.
Yeah, and perhaps that is the better way of doing things, that you have this one game, and if it is big enough, then you can start to create side stories for it, like Crisis Core and Dirge's Service and the Final Fantasy VII film. Did anybody see that? I did. I got very drunk to watch that film. I needed it. It was not
Final
good.
Fantasy film is great, but
It was
it's kind of
so
like
cool in its
how
era, but now it's not.
yeah, but what I was going to say is it's kind of like how there's that one which is set like, all those Final Fantasy games which just came out and they're all set in the tactics world, like the whole
Yeah, Everless
generation. I think it was
Alliance.
12, was it? Yeah,
It
and
was
everything
12
just set
and
in it.
then
Yeah.
Tactics Advanced and
Well, no,
original Tactics as well, and a bunch of other things.
Yeah, the original Tactics actually came before 12. But yeah, they're set in the same world. That's right. And then there was also
Then
the
you also
DS,
had the DS games as well, which was
strategy
set
one,
in
yeah.
that.
Yeah, Revenant
Yes.
Links.
So that was another good example of it. Perhaps a not so good example with the Final Fantasy series was Final Fantasy 13 trilogy, because
you love 13.3, right?
Oh, I absolutely love it. I think it's one of the best games I've ever played. But I was one of the very
Can you
few
play
people.
13.3 by itself, or do you
No.
have to play 13?
No, you 100% have to play both 13 and 13.2 before you can get to Lightning Returns.
You see, that just turns me off. That's just like,
Well, that's the thing. I
if you
think
tell me I need to play 80 hours of some other game to enjoy one of the best games in existence, I'm like, I'm not playing that.
Well, that's kind of why it was. I'm pretty sure it was the poorest selling Final Fantasy of all time as well, because you lose people, right? People who played 13, and it itself was quite a controversial game. Again, at the time, these days it's weird with Final Fantasy, and I think we've talked about this on the podcast in the past. Final Fantasy has this, yeah, Final Fantasy
retroactively, yeah, they become good.
Yeah.
We all love Final Fantasy 8 now.
Well, Final Fantasy X was hated at launch. People hated how linear it was. Now it's one of the most respected Final Fantasy. People hated Final Fantasy 12 at launch. People really did not like Final Fantasy 13. A decade later, for whatever reason, the prestige of these games seems to kind of grow back. But anyway,
I think it's actually because of this new system where whenever they release a new game, because it's not connected to the previous one, people compare it to the previous one and they realize the merits of the previous one now that they're not
retrospectively. Yeah, there is an element of that, I think.
Like when 16 comes out, everyone's going to play 15 again and be like, actually, I don't know if 15 is going to have the same thing. I think 15 was very mid, but maybe people will start to love it too.
I think another part of it is with Final Fantasy series, because people try to compare them to previous games, but they're not really comparable because they exist in different universes, have different characters and different whatever. Because there's no real point of comparison, trying to make a comparison ends up with you being disappointed with how it's done. But given the time of years, given the span of years, when you can look at it with a more kind of sober mindset that this game's been out for quite a while now and it is what it is, and you've come to terms with the systems, when you start looking at it at its own merits, then all of a sudden you start to realize, oh, hang on, it's actually not bad. And I think Final Fantasy 13 is a good example of that people were really annoyed that it was this really, really linear thing. But given a fair few years, you realize that the linearity was there because the focus was on the story they were telling, and the gameplay was really, in support of that. And then you realize, oh, the story is actually really good. So then Final Fantasy 13 suddenly becomes better. As to whether Final Fantasy 15 will or not, I don't know. I think that once they did all the DLC and stuff, I actually think Final Fantasy 15 actually became a game that people generally liked. So I think the perception's already there that it's better than it was at launch.
It's kind of dampened now. I feel like now that time has passed, people look back and go, yeah, but I don't think that was one of the greats.
What I think is nobody's going to be looking for a re-release of that one anytime soon.
Well, it's still pretty available, I guess.
Well,
it's not hard to get our hands of.
When we get to the next generation of consoles, for example, and if Final Fantasy 15 isn't compatible with, or the next generation of console aren't, they're not compatible with the old ones. Whether people are actually out there saying, give us a remake of Final Fantasy 15, I'm not
Give
sure.
us 4, 5, and 6 on Switch as well.
So, I think just generally, to bring it back to the topic, Final Fantasy is a good example of the benefits of making each game independent of one another. And then within that, if there is enough demand, you can start to do things like Final Fantasy VII, like you said before, that you can add extra games and you can find new stories and you can do the remake, which kind of undoes a lot of what the original story did. and you can do a lot of that experimentation. I will say doing that is kind of retrospective. So Final Fantasy VII, when they added Dirge of Cerberus and Crisis Core in the movie and all of that was kind of attached to the base game. So it didn't feel like there was the world, which the Legend of Heroes series does. There is the world with all the stories to tell within it. That was a more proactive approach to this kind of grand plan. So it does feel different.
Falcom set out to make Legend of the Heroes that way? Like, did they start writing with the intention of making 4 huge games?
I would have to assume so. Like, there's just no way you could do it otherwise.
Like, are there plot points in, say, Trails 3 or whatever that go, oh, this had to have been planned from Trails 1?
Well, Cold Steel 4 is probably the best example, because Cold Steel 4 is like the accumulation of everything that happened, not just from Trails of Cold Steel, but everything that happened with the series. There are characters that get name dropped in there that I can't remember actually appeared in Cold Steel at all until that point. So I just can't imagine such a complex project could have been done without some kind of planning beforehand. There's probably some, gigantic storyboard somewhere, or some kind of mind map that shows the various ideas for that series. That would have had to have been planned out at some point early on.
There's also lots of examples of JRPGs where you feel them intending to start a big series, and the first game just doesn't really take off, and then we don't get it.
There is that risk as well. Like, if you're going to go and to put all the work into creating this massive project, and nobody buys the first one, then you're in a bit of trouble.
I find that actually that happens more with a lot of Western developers, because there are definitely attempts to make huge franchises and they end on cliffhangers, and then you just never get the second game.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is the problem, because the commercial realities come into it, and you can only keep making these games if they're going to keep selling. And there's no guarantees anything's going to sell these days. So, yeah.
Which one do you think is more profitable?
I mean, if you can, I guess, if you could, it's difficult, because I think a lot of the time the commercial challenges make things difficult. But if you could find a way of getting the licensing to the Trails of Cold, the Legends of Heroes series, you could continue to release those on every platform into forever. And as long as they keep making new games, people are going to have an incentive to go back and play the old games as well. Like, if they were to release Trails of Cold Steel 1 and 2 and Switch, people would buy that again.
Yeah. And so Trails fans are like diehard fans, right? They're gonna like stand by their franchise. Whereas there's tons of fans who are like, oh yeah, I like Final Fantasy VII. I have not played anything else in the series.
There is that too. Yeah, you do definitely cultivate a much more hardcore group. I think you do leave a lot of people out. There are people that will never get into Legends of Heroes because it is so intimidating. It doesn't matter how much they like. Exactly. It doesn't matter how much you like JRPGs. It doesn't matter even, necessarily how much time you have on your hands for them. There is just the basic reality that those games are quite intimidating in terms of their scope, and that puts people off. So you do leave some people behind, but on the other hand, you do have people that will then buy literally everything to do with that series. Kingdom Hearts is another good example of that. That the Kingdom Hearts fans are just, they hate it a lot of the time, but they still buy it.
That's so sad, but so true.
There's a lot of loyalty there, and there's the perception that you do need to participate in every chapter of that series. Whereas with Final Fantasy, a lot of people feel like, oh, this one doesn't appeal to me, I can skip this one.
Yeah,
and that's okay.
Like, I like the sci-fi side of it, so I'm going to skip 16, or like I like the fantasy side, so I'm going to skip 13 or something like that, right? That's much more common.
Yeah.
Whereas no one is going, oh, I'm going to skip Trails 3 because I have work, but next time when it comes out, I'm going to get the next one. Like, that's just not how it works.
Yeah, that's right. And that's why a lot of the Trails fans are not employed. And just like that, I've lost half the podcast audience.